In Russia, television is more than just entertainment. It is power. It shapes minds, moves elections, and silences dissent. Today, Vladimir Putin controls almost every major channel in the country. But 2 decades ago, Russian TV was vibrant, chaotic, and independent. In the 1990s, Russia was experiencing a boom in its free media. For the first time in its history, TV shows were independent and were openly criticizing the government. Shows like Contol, which aired from 1994, featuring political satire and portraying Putin as a soulless, emotionless figure. But when Putin became president in 1999, he decided all this had to stop. This is the incredible story of how one man took control over the Russian TV waves and orchestrated one of the most effective media takeovers in modern history. This is the story of how Vladimir Putin turned off Russian TV. Throughout most of the post-war period, TV and the media in Russia was strictly controlled. Programming typically glorified the Russian state and president, and dissent or critical voices were not tolerated. But when Gorbachev came to power and began to implement glasnost, or openness, the media became gradually freer in Russia and independent TV channels were launched. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia experienced a media explosion. Gone were the days of state censorship, at least for a while. Private channels emerged, journalists pushed boundaries, and political satire thrived. 2 oligarchs in particular came to dominate the TV landscape. Boris Berezovsky, who gained control of ORT, the biggest channel in Russia, and Vladimir Gazinsky, who founded NTV, the country's first truly independent news network. Berezovsky and Gazinsky didn't just own TV channels, they shaped public opinion. They helped to elect Yeltsin in 1996 and held the Kremlin accountable on air. Shows like The Other Day analysed each year in the USSR through a critical lens.
Добрый вечер. Это 38-я серия проекта «Намедни наша эра».
And 600 Seconds took to the airways every night for a skeptical look at the actions of the government. But the most biting and radical of them all was this one. Called Puppets, this Russian version of the British spitting image would openly mock and ridicule the politicians in Russia, which included Vladimir Putin. Then, enter Vladimir Putin. In 1999, Prime Minister Putin, a former KGB operative, was elevated to the position of acting president. His approval rating soared amid the Second Chechen War and a wave of nationalism. But there was one problem: the independent media. The real throne wasn't just in the Kremlin, it was on the television. In September 1999, there were a number of terrorist attacks in Moscow and other cities in Russia. Several buildings were bombed and many people were killed. The Kremlin blamed Chechen terrorists for the bombing. Gazinsky's NTV decided to take a more independent stance and launched an in-depth journalistic investigation, investigating the possibility that the FSB was staging explosions in an effort to influence the upcoming elections. Gazinsky was given an ultimatum: to remove this independent investigation from NTV or else face the consequences. Kaczynski refused to end the investigation. So, Putin moved quickly and ordered the Prosecutor General to launch an investigation into Kaczynski, apparently for fraud and misappropriation of funds. Kaczynski was arrested and incarcerated at the infamous Butkria prison. After 3 days of much public pressure, scandal and speculation, Kaczynski was released from prison and placed under house arrest. Putin said he would free Kaczynski, but under one condition: that he signed over his whole media empire to Gazprom Media, the state-controlled media giant. In other words, if Kaczynski wanted his freedom, he had to hand over his TV channels to Putin. He agreed, under duress, and Putin took control of NTV. Putin stormed NTV's news offices. Some NTV journalists resisted and protested. Some were fired and others resigned. Within just weeks, Russia's major independent TV news outlet and fully independent channel in Russia was silenced. The puppet TV show was taken off air, and the channel no longer criticised the government. It was as easy as that, and 1-0 to Putin, and he was only just getting started. Next up in Putin's firing line was ORT, Russia's biggest channel, where Boris Berezovsky, once a Putin ally, had wielded enormous influence. He had even once helped elevate Putin to power, but when he started to criticise the new president, he too became a target. Russia's main news programme, Vremya, started to air criticism of the president and the government. While ORT was less direct in its criticism, Putin nonetheless decided it could not be tolerated. And in 2001, under pressure from the Kremlin, Berezovsky sold his stake in ORT to Russian businessman Roman Abramovich. This was on the promise that one of Berezovsky's longtime friends would be released from prison. That never happened, and Roman Abramovich, who now had the controlling share in ORT, quickly sold his shares to the Kremlin. The Kremlin had taken control of ORT. It was all too easy for Putin. Seeing what was happening, Berezovsky tried to rebuild his media empire by purchasing controlling shares in TV6, which had at that point been a mostly entertainment channel focused on youth audiences. In fact, it broadcast Russia's very first reality show, Za Steklom, Behind the Glass, the Russian version of Big Brother. Berezovsky tried to move TV6 to be more of a news channel and hired many of the former journalists from NTV. Seeing what was happening, Putin took action. Under Putin's orders, Lukoil, a state-controlled oil company which owned 15% shares in TV6, used an obscure law that grants shareholders the right to dissolve a company if its net worth falls below a certain level for 2 years. In other words, Lukoil, with 15% shares, was going to force TV6 off the air. It was brutally effective, and the electricity was shut off just after midnight in 2002. Other broadcasters in the country, seeing what was happening, quickly began to toe the Kremlin line, and independence in Russian media grew smaller and smaller. By the mid-2000s, Putin had achieved what no Russian leader had ever since the Soviet era: near total control over national television. Journalists were expected to follow temniki, informal editorial guidelines issued by the president. Investigative reporters who crossed the line faced blacklists, or worse. Some paid the ultimate price. In 2006, journalist Anna Politkovskaya, known for her reporting on Chechnya and human rights abuses, was killed after numerous assassination attempts. On the 7th of October 2006, which is Putin's birthday, she was murdered in the elevator block of her apartments. In 2014, 5 men were sentenced to prison for the murder. It is officially unclear who ordered or paid for the contract killing, but you may be able to work it out. Today, Putin continues with his old tricks to limit any new channels attempting dissent. TV Rain was an independent news channel launched in 2010. However, after they started criticising Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its owners and presenters were forced to flee the country, saying that their personal safety had come under threat. The crew walked off set and played Swan Lake in protest, in reference to the 1991 coup d'etat attempt, where channels could not report the news and instead played footage of the ballet. Today in modern Russia, Putin continues to control the narrative, in particular by having presenters act as the mouthpiece of the president. Shows like this one, An Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, are hugely popular across Russia and feature its presenters supporting Putin and the Kremlin narrative. Putin's takeover of the media is dictatorship 101. But, in true Putin style, this was not done with a violent ambush of studios, or even a huge amount of flair. It was calculated, careful and planned. Done by exploiting obscure laws, bureaucracy, ownership structures, and exerting political pressure. He only had to kill one journalist to send a clear message to the thousands of others. Putin's media empire of today was not built overnight. It was calculated, brutal, and astonishingly effective. Because, in modern Russia, whoever controls the screen controls the story.